is trying to pull together some different projects. So I'm going to explain a little bit today about the history of women and girls cricket in Scotland, and then tell you a bit about the current projects that we're doing as a research group. So to start off with, we formed the research network back in 2023, and we had a sort of small organising group, but then a much bigger network of people who were interested in contributing. And so just to name those people: James Bryce, Sue Strachan and Annette Aitken-Drummond, as well as Raf and myself. And we were supported at the start by a grant from the Voluntary Sector Studies Network. And we are now also supported by a community grant from Sporting Heritage and the National Lottery. We're looking not just at history, but also at contemporary research as well. Overall, in this form of this presentation, we're going to look at this 145 years to try to understand what's happened to Scottish women and girls cricket. So we're going to look starting from 1878 up to the present day. And Raf, who is presenting alongside me, is now going to start to tell us a bit about the history side, so back in 1878. So if I can hand over to you, Raf.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Yeah, so as far as we're aware, the first recorded women's cricket match in Scotland took place in 1878. But partly this project is actually about trying to kind of find out a little bit more and discover whether that's actually true. Can I have the next slide, Fiona? So the first recorded match in 1878 was actually played by St Leonard's School, a large girls' public school that had been founded the year previously. And they were a kind of pioneer in terms of physical education for girls. So there's a couple of nice photos on the slide of sort of early cricket from St Leonard's. And Betty Archdale, the first ever England captain, attended St Leonard's. That would have been post First World War, so sort of the early 1920s. And there's a lovely quote from her on the slide indicating the importance of cricket as opposed to tennis, which was felt to be a rather sissy game only played by those who could not play cricket. So cricket was very much part of the school culture. Can I have the next slide, please? And the next one, Fiona. Now, interestingly enough, England and Scotland, who have actually never faced each other in a T20 international, they're going to be doing that for the first time in a few days, actually have played each other in a multi-innings match, in a two-innings match, in 1932. And this is kind of one of the earliest examples, actually, of an international cricket match, even though it's not regarded as an official international, but it took place in 1932, August 1932. So more than 2 years before the first, what's considered the first official international between England and Australia women in December 1934. So yeah, it's really interesting that we actually know that this happened, that it took place at Worcester, and we do have a scorecard. If you have a quick look at the scorecard, you can see that for Scotland, a woman called Myrtle McLagan, who would go on and play for England, was actually a key part of the Scotland side. She qualified for Scotland by virtue of the fact that her father was Scottish. So she took a combined 6 for 77 and top scored in both innings. But unfortunately, Scotland lost. So that's a nice match about which little is known. Next slide, Fiona.
Oh, do you want the one back? Sorry. There.
No, that's fine. Yeah, let's go on to the next one. So there's actually a nice letter from Myrtle McLagan, who, as I say, would go on and play Test cricket for England against Australia, and score the first ever women's Test century in early 1935. This is a letter from her, though, that was written a bit later in 1980, when she's kind of looking back at this England-Scotland match that took place in 1932. And she actually says that she was selected for both England and Scotland, because as I say, her father was Scottish, but her mother was English. And she says, I was very young, mad, keen, and very bucked by being selected for both teams. Naturally, I elected to play for Scotland. And as the scorecard shows, she was quite important in that match. Next slide, Fiona. Yeah, so just a little bit more information there about some of the Scottish connections that the early England players had. So we've talked about Myrtle McLagan, we've talked about Betty Archdale, who also represented Scotland in that 1932 match because she was educated in Scotland and then captained England in 1934-35. Betty Snowball is another St Leonard's alumni who famously scored 189 against New Zealand in 1935 in one of the very early women's tests. And there's another lady called Joy Liebert, who also was at St Leonard's, also represented Scotland in 1932 and then was on that first England tour. So kind of nationality was a little bit more perhaps porous. Then these were the kind of Kirsty Gordons of their day, but they could switch back and forth between England and Scotland slightly more at will. Am I handing back to you now, Fiona?
Yes. So thanks, Raf. So I think we're kind of looking and thinking that Scotland and England at that point were quite close back in 1932. The players were representing either team were strong, and there was a close match. But now when we look to the present day, we see there's quite a difference between how women's cricket's evolved from within Scotland compared to within England. So, for example, there's an estimated 300 female cricketers in Scotland compared with 132,000 estimated in England and Wales. And in Scotland, there are 7 women's teams in the Premier League, and there are 220 cricket leagues in England and Wales for women. So there's quite a difference in how cricket has developed, perhaps both in England and Scotland. And the question really that we then wanted to ask was what happened to Scottish women's cricket, given that it's got quite a different trajectory. So after we know the women's cricket had started at St Leonard's School, we know that there was club cricket in Scotland, and these are just some of the examples. And we, as Raf was saying, we hope to find out more due to our project, to find out more club sides that had women's teams or women's clubs. But these are some of the examples of clubs that we do know about in the early 20th century. And that's across the country, so north and south. And we know there was also women's cricket in Dumfries as well in the early 20th century. But one of the, this is, I think I'm handing to Raf to say about this.
Yeah, sure. So one thing that we have kind of uncovered is that actually there was a very close relationship between English and Scottish women's cricket in the early days. As that kind of segment about players seeming to be able to switch back and forth between England and Scotland in that 1932 or ahead of that 1932 game kind of suggests. So the Women's Cricket Association in England was formed in 1926, but actually amongst their objects was specifically to organise visits of teams from England to Scotland, continuing this strong link with St Leonard's. The WCA actually toured there in 1929 and 1930, and we've talked about that 1932 match. Then there continued to be some relationship between England and Scotland. There was another match in 1936 at Colwall, and one of the interesting things that we then see is that actually kind of post-war women's cricket in Scotland struggles somewhat. So looking at the WCA records and their affiliated sides, for most of the period between 1926 and 1998, there's only a couple of teams who are affiliated within Scotland. There may have been other unaffiliated cricket that we don't know about. One of those was St Leonard's School, one of those was Edinburgh University. Next slide, please, Fiona. So it's interesting that then there's a little bit of a revival in the late 1970s, and we're not really sure kind of sort of why that was. It would be really interesting to know a little bit more about that, but there's actually a Scotland tour to Ireland in 1978, and there's some newspaper coverage of that on the slide. Can I have the next slide, Fiona? So actually what we know is that in 1977, a couple of English women, so continuing this theme of a close relationship between England and Scotland, a couple of English women actually started their own Scottish Women's Cricket Association. And there were reports about this in the Cricketer. By September 1977, they had 60 players. They played fixtures against Yorkshire and of course that Ireland tour that we've just mentioned. There was a Scottish 11 who played at Cricket Week in Herefordshire in England. This was this kind of annual festival of cricket organised by the Women's Cricket Association. And in November 1979, this Scottish WCA actually wrote to the English WCA and said, we'd like to have regular fixtures. But a couple of years after that, Scotland were invited to join the International Women's Cricket Council, but they declined. And other than knowing that happened, we're not sure why. We're not sure kind of why this Scottish WCA that formed in 1977 seems to have kind of petered out within a few years. So there's all sorts of things that it'd be really interesting to explore further. Fiona, I think I might be handing back to you now.
Yes. So what happened, we just don't know, and we'd really like to find out, because we're jumping then to the 2000s, because at that point in Scotland, the Scottish Cricket Union, as the governing body for Scotland was known as then, decided to form its first national women's team, and they debuted at the 2001 European Championship. And we know the names, at least, of the people who participated for Scotland, or who were selected for Scotland from 2000 onwards. And we do have a picture of the first team in 2000. It does look like it might have been, 1878. It's so grainy, but we do have that photo, and we do know who those people were. And more recently, retrospective caps have been awarded, so some of those people are then sitting in the present day, receiving those in 2019, or receiving them individually if they were found. So Abby Aitken-Drummond has been doing a lot of work to try and find those people who should have, or who get a retrospective cap. So there has been work done to try and find out more. We don't have a lot of information about more than the names of a lot of these players, and that's something you'll see later we're going to be doing more of a project about. Just to carry on this theme of seeing that Scotland and England women's cricket has taken a kind of different trajectory, these are just some of the figures that I mentioned earlier, so that we can see we can see the comparison. And so despite, we know England and Wales are a lot bigger than Scotland, but even so, the numbers of cricketers and the number of cricket opportunities has really changed over time. So our research group was really formed thinking we want to know a lot more about both the history and the present day cricket for women and girls. And cricket includes all of those people associated, not simply players, but also officials, spectators, supporters, volunteers, committee members, ground staff, really anybody involved in the game, so that wider community. And we're really interested in knowing more about club, school, representative cricket, involvement of women in the wider game, for example, women facilitating other people's cricket, and the governance of cricket. So all of those were set up as some of the aims of the research group. So what we did to start off with was a rapid scoping review to see if we could find out what was known, what was already known about women and girls cricket. That scoping review found 3 publications, which you can see pictured there. which included sections. So the Secret Game has a chapter about that 2000 approximately women's team then. There's obviously a section about Scotland in Rath's book, and the Scottish players are mentioned. And then Jane Claydon has written the history of cricket at St Leonard's, which is, we know where cricket started. So those three publications were the three that we found. Doing a wider academic search, we came up with very little other academic literature. This is relevant because when we're trying to understand what's already there, there was a small study into injury in the Scotland women's cricket team, and there were various club histories or blogs that did mention women. There are also Cricket Scotland annual reports, and one of those in 2001 contained that picture of the women's team, for example. And there was a recent Cricket Scotland survey which included women's cricket as part and did analyse women's cricket separately. And the Cricket Scotland historian does have an archive which includes some women's information, for example, a list of those players who've received a cap. However, that's not a huge amount that we've already known. And in fact, what we found was there was a very big missing evidence. So really, there's not much written or published about Scottish women and girls cricket. And we felt there was an urgent need to collate what we did know and experiences of those who were still alive, perhaps, or who had information, and that we definitely needed to consider different time periods as well. There are also assumptions made about the involvement of women and girls in cricket, and that can be based on little or no evidence. As we've discovered, there isn't very much, and also extremely few mentions of the wider group of women who would be supporting the women's game. So these were all gaps that we discovered. So we're looking to fill those gaps, and that's what our next projects are doing. So this would be a really good time for us just to tell you a little bit about the two projects that we're putting into practice just now. My contact details are there, but also we'll share them on the next slide as well. So as a group, we have thought that Project 2028 is what we would like to be carrying out. We feel that 150 years of women and girls cricket in Scotland should be marked, and we want to create and display an exhibition about that. And that would be 2028, 150 years since the first known match at the moment. That's not funded as yet. That's what we'd like to be able to do. We also need any enthusiastic cricket historians or volunteers to come forward who'd like to help us with that. And we're looking to hear more stories and experiences from the wider cricketing community in Scotland and their descendants, because we might be thinking about people who are no longer with us, but perhaps we've got things that they owned. What we have been able to do is set up a pilot project, which is funded by our Sporting Heritage Community Grant, and that is running from now until 2025. And I just want to finish with information about that. We're collecting oral histories and more information really about what was going on in Scottish women and girls cricket between 1998 and 2002, which is when the formation of that team happened. And we'd love to hear from anyone that was involved at that time. And we've set up a link where anybody you could obviously email me, but also you can click on the link and say you'd be interested. And that would also go for anyone who wants to help us to understand more about it. You don't have to have been one of those people. So yeah, just the final thing to say is we've got this very active project, and if you know of anyone who might have been involved at that time, please do pass this on to them. So that's the end of the presentation. I don't know whether it's time for questions now, Philippa.
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. Thanks, Raf. It's really interesting, and it's nice to have the opportunity for people to share in a project that's still live as well, and the opportunity to sort of be part of that in various different ways. Yeah, so I'll open up to questions. You can either put them in the chat or put your hand up. I'm happy whichever works best. Just while people are sort of typing or thinking, the 1970 teams and the sort of formation, I guess, of the Scottish Women's Cricket Association. Is there any evidence that that was funded, or that there was any relationship between that and the emergence of that time at all?
Shall I take this one, Fiona?
Yeah, yes, go for it, Raf.
We really know very little about it, other than the references to it that were in the Cricketer magazine, and then a couple that were in the English Women's Cricket Association minutes. It's very interesting to me that it seems to have been started by two English women, one of which had kind of been stationed up there because her husband was in the military. And so actually it wasn't coming from within Scotland at that time. It was still kind of England or English people, English women going, oh, well, we've been playing cricket in England, so we'll sort of bring it into Scotland. So as far as I'm aware, it was a sort of voluntary undertaking by a couple of women who wanted to continue being able to play cricket, having moved from England to Scotland. But I don't know whether they managed to get any funding. It'd be really interesting to find out a bit more about that, actually.
Yeah,
I think the fact that they declined the invitation to join the IWCC is really interesting. It'd be really fascinating to find out a bit more about that when you.
Yeah, I agree. But if we're thinking back to that time and it's an unofficial group of volunteers who are organising this, then their circumstances may just have changed, and that meant when they were asked, could you join, that particular person that was asked couldn't conceive of how they could join, rather than a necessary, but we don't know that